You finally said it. Maybe it was to your mom, the one who calls 4 times a day and then guilt trips you when you don't pick up. Maybe it was to a friend who's been leaning on you so hard for so long that you can't remember the last time they asked you how you were doing. Maybe it was to a partner or a boss or a sibling. Maybe it was just to yourself, quietly, in your own head, saying, I can't keep doing this. And you worked up to it, maybe for weeks, months, maybe for years. You rehearsed the words. You talked it through with your therapist or your journal or your best friend at 2 a.m. You'd read articles, listened to podcasts. You knew the language and you were ready. And then you said it and you waited to feel relief. And instead, what showed up? Dread, guilt, regret, a hollow, sick feeling in your chest. The immediate urge to walk it all back. An anxiety so specific, it almost has a physical shape, like something is very wrong and your job is to fix it as fast as possible. Maybe you even cried or lay awake, replaying the conversation over and over, editing it, softening it, erasing yourself from it entirely. You set the boundary, and instead of feeling relief, you feel worse than you did before. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I'm your host, Jackie Pack. And today we're going to talk about why that happens, because it's actually one of the most common, most disorienting, and most under-discussed experiences in the psychology of self-development. If you've felt this and thought it meant you did something wrong, or that boundaries just aren't for people like you, that boundaries are selfish, stay with me today because I'm going to tell you why it's actually a sign that your nervous system and your psychology are working exactly as they were designed to. Just maybe not for the life you're trying to build. Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm so glad you're here today because the topic we're covering is what I've wanted to dive into in depth for a long time. And today we're finally doing it. We're talking about the boundary hangover. That's not a clinical term. I just made that up, but I think it captures something very real. That period after you've set a limit, you've named a need, and you've drawn a line where instead of feeling liberated and light, you feel like you've done something terrible. Like you've hurt someone, ruined something, or acted out of character in the worst possible way. And a lot of people, because of it, walk their boundaries back. They apologize for having them. And they contort themselves back into the shape the other person preferred. They tell themselves they're just not ready yet. Maybe they'll try again someday when they're stronger, or maybe not. The boundary hangover isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's information. It's your psychology doing exactly what it learned to do. And when you understand why it happens, mechanically, emotionally, and neurologically, it loses a lot of power over you because you know to expect it. So today in this episode, we're going to move through several things. We're going to look at what we've been told to expect from boundaries and why that sets us up for confusion. We're going to dig deep into the specific psychological and physiological reasons the aftermath often feels so bad. And we're going to talk about what's actually happening in your nervous system when a familiar dynamic gets disrupted. And then we're going to talk about what actually helps. Not the toxic positivity version, not just feel the feelings, but concrete, grounded ways to move through the hangover without abandoning yourself. So grab a drink, get comfortable, and let's get into it. Let's start with the story we've been sold. The narrative around boundaries in the self-help and wellness space is broadly this: you've been giving too much, you've been tolerating things you shouldn't tolerate, you've been people-pleasing, shrinking, overextending, saying yes when you meant no. And the solution, the path to freedom, is to set boundaries. Name your limits, enforce them. And when you do, you will feel better. You will feel relieved. You will feel more like yourself. That's the story. And it's not entirely wrong. That is where you're headed eventually. Boundaries over time, with practice, with support, in the right relational context, they generally do lead to more peace, more authenticity, and more self-respect. So I'm not here to tell you that the story you're told about why boundaries are necessary is a lie. But the timeline in that story is almost dangerously misleading, because it suggests that the relief comes at the moment the boundary is spoken, or maybe right after. That you set the limit and this relief washes over you, this freedom arrives like a package on your front porch. And for most people, especially people who are setting boundaries in relationships where the pattern has been longstanding and where there's a significant power differential, where approval and love have been tightly entangled, that's not what happens. Not even close. What actually happens looks more like this. You set the boundary, and immediately your system internally goes into something resembling crisis. Your body floods with cortisol. Your mind starts catastrophizing. You feel guilty, frightened, disloyal, selfish. You start scanning the other person's face for evidence that you've destroyed something irreplaceable. You run simulations of every possible worst-case scenario. And somewhere underneath all of that, a very old, very primal part of you is screaming, take it back. Make it right. Don't let this stand. And the wellness narratives that we've been given has no map for that territory. It skips right over it, which means when you land there, you think you've made a wrong turn. You've arrived exactly where most people arrive. You just weren't prepared that it was a place. I think part of the reason this gets glossed over is that boundaries as a concept have become a bit of cultural shorthand. They're on Instagram graphics. They've been reduced to a kind of self-care vocabulary that sounds clean and empowering, but doesn't actually prepare anyone for the lived emotional experience of them. Real boundaries, especially first-time ones, especially in relationships with complex histories, are not clean. And they're not empowering in the moment. They can actually be destabilizing. And until we start telling that truth openly, we're going to keep producing people who feel like they're failing at something that they're actually doing right. So let's look at why it actually feels worse. Let's go through the mechanisms because there are several and they layer on top of each other. Understanding each one separately makes the whole thing make so much more sense. I want to walk you through 7 reasons, 7 distinct psychological and relational mechanisms that explain why setting a boundary, especially a meaningful one, often produces distress instead of relief. Now, they're not in any particular order of importance because honestly, they all matter. So let's go through them, knowing they're randomly placed in order. The first one, and possibly the most disorienting, is guilt. Almost universally, people who set limits with other people feel guilty about it afterward, even when the limit was completely reasonable, even when the behavior they were responding to was genuinely harmful. And even when, if a stranger described the situation, they would say, "Of course you set that boundary. Why would you feel bad about that?" But the guilt comes anyway. And here's the thing about guilt that our culture tends to get a little confused about. Guilt is a feeling. It's not a verdict. It's not a conclusion. Guilt tells you that you have violated a rule, but it doesn't tell you whether that rule is actually a good rule. It doesn't tell you whether the rule deserves your obedience. It just tells you that something you believe you are supposed to do or be, you aren't currently doing or being. For a lot of people, especially people who grew up in environments where their emotional needs were secondary to someone else's, and where keeping the peace was survival, where being good meant being selfless, and where love felt conditional on compliance, the rules that got installed include things like you do not inconvenience the people you love. You do not cause discomfort. You don't put yourself first. You manage other people's feelings before you manage your own. When those are your installed rules, setting a boundary, of course, will trigger guilt. Setting a boundary will trigger guilt because you just broke a rule, a deeply embedded, possibly lifelong rule. But again, guilt in this context is not telling you that you did something wrong. It's telling you that you did something unfamiliar. And that's different. That's actually useful information because it means you're changing, and changing, real long-lasting change, is supposed to feel like a rule violation. That's what change is. The second reason people feel worse after boundaries is one that almost nobody talks about: grief. When you set a limit with someone, especially someone you love, especially someone you've had a long dynamic with, you are also implicitly saying, this relationship is not what I thought it was or what I hoped it would be. You wanted a mother who could handle your needs without collapsing. You wanted a friendship where care went both ways. You wanted a partnership where you could say, that hurt me, without being punished for it. And somewhere in the act of setting the boundary, you're confronting the gap between what you wanted and what exists. That is a loss. And all loss deserves to be grieved. But often we don't frame it that way. We frame boundary setting as empowerment, which, yes, it is in the big picture. But we also forget that empowerment and grief can coexist. That you can be doing exactly the right thing and be mourning the version of the relationship you needed it to be. The grief also extends to the self, because for a long time, you were a different version of yourself in this dynamic. You were someone who said yes when you meant no, who smiled when you were hurting, who made themselves small to make space for someone else. And that version of you, even if they weren't happy, even if the situation was costing you something, it was familiar. That was how you knew to be. And you probably got rewarded for that. Setting the boundary means you're not being that person anymore. Even when it's growth, even when it's clearly the healthier direction, there can be a kind of mourning for the old way of being, because at least you knew how that worked. And this brings me right into reason 3, identity disruption. Our sense of self is largely relational. We understand who we are in part by how we behave with other people, by the roles we occupy in relationships, and by the stories we've built about ourselves. If you've been the dependable one, the giver, the person who never complains, the one who holds everything together, then those aren't just behaviors. They've become your identity. They're how you understand your value. They're what you've been told, either implicitly or explicitly, makes you good, worthy, and lovable. So when you set a boundary that disrupts that role, when you say, I can't always be the one who holds this, you're not just changing a behavior, you're destabilizing an identity. And the psyche does not shift that comfortably. The psyche will actually fight it. It will produce all the symptoms of existential threat, anxiety, disorientation, the desperate urge to return to familiar ground. There's a term in therapy, disowned self. Parts of ourselves that we learned were unacceptable. Often that's our needs, our preferences, our anger, our limitations that we buried in order to be loved. When you start setting boundaries, you're often in the process of reclaiming disowned parts of yourself. And the psyche's response is not, welcome home. It's often more like, are you sure about this? Because I don't know what's going to happen if we let this out. The discomfort you feel is the discomfort of reorganizing your sense of self. It's significant, it's real, and it doesn't just go away in a day. Reason number 4 is one that operates at a really primal level, fear of abandonment. For humans as a species, social rejection is not just uncomfortable. It's genuinely dangerous. For most of our evolutionary history, being cast out from the group was essentially a death sentence. And so our nervous system evolved to be exquisitely sensitive to any sign that we were at risk of being excluded, rejected, or unloved. Setting a boundary almost always, to some degree, risks the relationship. Even a small boundary, even a completely reasonable one. There is always the possibility that the other person will respond badly. They'll withdraw. They'll be hurt. They might decide you're too difficult. And some part of you, usually a very loud part, is tracking that risk constantly. So after you set the boundary, your threat detection system is on high alert. Every text that isn't responded to immediately feels like evidence of rejection. Every change in the other person's tone is a data point. You're hypervigilant, exhausted, and scanning for signs that you've broken something that can't be repaired. For people who grew up in environments where love was unpredictable, where affection was conditional, where caregivers were intermittently warm and cold, this hypervigilance is not new. It's a very old skill. And it's the psyche doing its job. Keep the attachment, don't lose the bond. Do whatever it takes to stay safe and loved. What's new is that you're asking the system to tolerate the risk that comes with authenticity. And that's genuinely a big ask. It's not weakness that you respond the way that you do. It's physiology. Reason 5 is cognitive dissonance. And this one operates a little bit more in the intellectual layer. Cognitive dissonance is the discomfort that arises when you hold two beliefs that contradict each other. And the boundary situation is almost a textbook case of it. On one hand, you have the belief that got you to the boundary. I deserve to have my needs respected. Or this dynamic has not been healthy. Or I need something to change. On the other hand, you have a whole collection of older, louder beliefs. I should always be there for the people I love. A good daughter, friend, partner doesn't put conditions on relationships. Needing things is selfish. The fact that I'm causing this person discomfort means I've done something wrong. Both sets of beliefs feel real. Both also feel true. The problem is they're directly in conflict with each other. And the brain hates this. The brain wants coherence. So it starts working overtime to resolve the tension. Most often it does this by attacking the newer beliefs, because the newer belief is more fragile. It doesn't have decades of repetition behind it. The older belief of I should put others first has been reinforced probably tens of thousands of times. So when your brain is looking for a way to reduce the dissonance, it naturally defaults to dismantling the new belief. This is why the internal monologue after a boundary is often so harsh. It might sound like, who do you think you are? You're being selfish. You're going to ruin everything. Why couldn't you have just let it go? That's not truth. That's cognitive dissonance resolution. It's your brain trying to get back to a familiar, coherent internal state. Naming it as that, saying this is dissonance, this is my brain trying to resolve contradiction, gives you a little bit of distance from it. It won't completely eliminate it or quiet it, but it makes it more legible. Reason 6 is a little more subtle, but I think it's a very important one. I'll often call it the void. Every relationship has a dynamic, a pattern of interaction, a choreography almost. And often that choreography even when it's unhealthy, serves a function. It gives structure to the relationship. It provides predictability. It fills space, and it gives both people a role. When you change your part in the choreography, you create a gap. And that gap is uncomfortable. Not just for the other person, but for you too, even if you did it intentionally. Because when the dynamic was costing you something, it was still something. It was known, it was familiar, it occupied space that now feels empty and uncertain. And we don't like uncertainty. Think about it this way. If you were the person who always called first, you were always the one who checked in, made the plans, always kept the friendship alive, allowed space for the other person to be imperfect. And then you stop to see what happens, to let the other person step up. The period after you stop is not as peaceful. There's often an acute kind of discomfort. The silence feels wrong, and the urge to fill it is almost physical. That urge is about being a person who's been doing a certain thing for a long time, and the absence of it feels like something is broken. It takes time, sometimes a lot of time, for the nervous system to calibrate to a new normal. To learn that the silence is not an emergency, that the gap is not a catastrophe, and that you can tolerate not knowing how the other person is going to respond to a more equitable dynamic. The void is not permanent, but in the early days, it feels enormous. I remember setting a boundary. This was several years ago. I'll probably talk about it in an upcoming episode I want to record. But I remember doing this, and I remember driving in the car with my husband. It wasn't a boundary I set with him, but it did impact him. It was just the two of us driving in a car. And I said to him, "This feels so painful." He agreed and said, "Yeah, it does feel painful." It also impacted him directly. But in this situation, it was more direct for me. And I said to him, "I think it will take me 2 years to start adjusting to this." And he said, "Yeah, probably." Now, when I said that, I don't know that I kept track of it to say, "Oh, yeah, it was 2 years." I think I just picked that, speaking to the intensity of the pain that I felt. The last reason or mechanism that I want to name is one that I think is the deepest and the hardest. When you set a boundary, you're often saying goodbye to a fantasy. And it's not a frivolous one. It's not a naive one. It's usually a very human, very understandable hope that the relationship would eventually become what you needed it to be. If you were patient enough, giving enough, understanding enough, someday this person would change. They'd be able to see you, maybe even meet the real you, and love you the way you needed to be loved. Setting the boundary is, in some ways, an acknowledgement that that's not going to happen, at least not in the way that you hoped. And that is a profound loss. Not just a loss of a current relationship dynamic, but of a future you were holding on to. A version of things getting better that required no disruption, no risk, and no difficult conversations. The relief does come eventually when you realize that by releasing the fantasy, you made room for something real. But in the short term, all you feel is the release itself, the absence of hope. And that is legitimately painful. This is grief, like I talked about in Reason 2, but it's a specific kind, ambiguous grief. The grief of losing something you never fully had, but you believed in. Let's take a few minutes to get a little physiological, because I think understanding what's happening in your body also helps explain why the discomfort is so physical. It's not just emotional, like sad. It also shows up like it's nauseating, or it's chest tightening, or it's head spinning. Your nervous system has two primary modes of operation. You've probably heard of them. The sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest state. And overlaying both of those is the polyvagal system, which is a more nuanced framework developed by Stephen Porges that includes a third state, the ventral vagal, which is the system responsible for social engagement, the feeling of being safe enough to connect. Under chronic stress, like the kind that comes with being in an unbalanced relationship dynamic for a long time, many people are operating primarily from the sympathetic system. There's high alert, hypervigilance, managing the other person's reactions, anticipating their needs, and always trying to stay 2 steps ahead to keep the peace. This is exhausting, but it's also familiar. The nervous system has calibrated to it. It knows the rules of the game. When you set a boundary or when you stop performing the hypervigilant management, a few things happen physiologically. First, there's often a spike of sympathetic activation. Cortisol and adrenaline flood in. Your body is treating this as a threat event because you just changed a pattern that, even if it was unhealthy, was known. And the nervous system doesn't evaluate whether a pattern is good for you. It evaluates whether it's familiar. Familiar equals safe. Unfamiliar equals threat. So that physical anxiety that you feel after setting the boundary, that's a stress response. It's your body trying to get you to return to the familiar pattern, because the familiar pattern, however painful, doesn't feel like a threat. Second, many people experience what looks like a freeze or shutdown response. The flatness, exhaustion, the sense of I did the hard thing and now I can't feel anything. That's often the dorsal vagal response, the oldest part of the nervous system shutting down to conserve resources in the face of perceived overwhelm. It's not depression necessarily, and it's not failure. It's a physiological response to a high-stakes relational event. Third, and this is the one that often sneaks up on people, there can be a kind of withdrawal effect. If the relationship involved any amount of intermittent reinforcement, moments of warmth followed by coldness, validation followed by criticism, closeness followed by distance, your brain has probably built up a reward circuit around the positive moments. The warm texts after the hard conversation, the approval that came after you complied, and the closeness that followed the conflict. When you set a boundary, you're disrupting access to those reward moments. And the brain responds to that disruption similarly to how it responds to any withdrawal from a reinforcement pattern. You feel something close to longing, preoccupation, obsessive thinking about the person or the relationship. And this is not pathological. This is your brain's reward system adjusting to change in its reinforcement pattern. In therapy, we may talk about it, but we're not necessarily trying to rush through it or fix it. We're going to let it follow the course that it needs to follow. Understanding this physiologically, really internalizing what you're feeling, is in large part a neurobiological process, not a character flaw, can be genuinely transformative because it means you can stop treating your distress as evidence that you made the wrong choice. It's not evidence. It's chemistry. It's a nervous system doing what nervous systems do. The good news, the real good news, is that nervous systems are plastic. They rewire, they calibrate to new patterns given enough time and enough repetition. The nervous system that currently treats setting a boundary as a threat can learn to treat it as safety. That's basic neuroplasticity. But it does require tolerating the discomfort of the transition period without sprinting back to the old pattern. And tolerating it is a skill, one that can be built. Now that we've talked about this, I want to take a slight turn here and get honest about the limitations of the way boundaries are talked about in mainstream wellness culture. Because I think there are a few things we're actively getting wrong, and they're making things harder for people. The first thing that we get wrong is that boundaries are not a one-time event. The way the concept of boundaries is often presented, it sounds like one single moment. You say the words, the limit is established, the relationship shifts, and you're done. The boundary is set. But real limits, especially in long-standing relationships, require ongoing maintenance. They require repetition. They require holding your ground when the other person tests them. And often they will. They require recommitting to yourself every time your guilt tells you to cave. The emotional work doesn't end when the words come out of your mouth. In many ways, that's where it begins. And that's important to know going in. Because if you think you'll do it once and then feel better, the reality of the maintenance phase can feel like you didn't do it right. That's not true. It's just what it actually takes. The second thing is that not every relationship can or will survive genuine limits. This is a hard truth. And I think wellness culture has been a little conflict avoidant about it. There is sometimes an implicit promise that if you communicate clearly enough, your approach is loving enough, with the right I statements, the other person will come around. The relationship will become more mutual, and the dynamic will shift. Sometimes that happens. I've seen it. And I don't want to take that hope away from anyone. But sometimes when the other person's identity or their sense of power or their sense of relationship depends on you not having limits, they often won't adapt. Instead, they will escalate. They will guilt trip. They'll withdraw. They'll retaliate or simply leave. And that outcome, that loss, is something the boundary conversation often doesn't prepare you for. Setting a boundary means that you are accepting that risk. And accepting that risk is an act of courage. not selfishness. The third thing is that limits set in trauma responses can be complicated. This one is pretty nuanced and important. Sometimes what gets labeled a boundary is actually a response pattern that originated in survival. The person who stops letting anyone get close, not because they've chosen it consciously, but because closeness has always meant pain. The person who sets rigid, inflexible limits that push people away, not because their limits are unreasonable, but because their nervous system never learned to tolerate closeness or proximity. Now, this isn't a criticism of those patterns. In context, they make complete sense. But it's worth being curious about, am I setting this because it genuinely reflects what I need and value? Or am I setting it because I'm scared? And creating distance will feel like safety. Both can be true simultaneously, but knowing which one is driving the bus or knowing which one has more power helps you make more conscious choices. And then the fourth thing is that the people around you may not celebrate your limits. There's sometimes an expectation that growth is celebrated. That when you start showing up differently with more authenticity, self-respect, with clearer needs and with boundaries, the people in your life will cheer. They'll say, I'm so proud of you. And that they'll adapt easily and gracefully. I think healthy people who are accustomed to boundaries, both receiving them and setting them, they will respond that way. But others won't. Some people have their own investment in the version of you that didn't have limits. Some people will feel threatened, judged, or abandoned by your growth, even if you're not doing it to them. And some will get weird about it in ways you didn't expect. This is a normal part of the process. It doesn't mean you did something wrong. It means that all systems, including relationship systems, tend to resist change. And sometimes the most meaningful growth is the loneliest for a while before it becomes freeing. Let's say you've set the boundary. You feel terrible. You know why you feel terrible. We've talked about all the mechanisms together. Now what happens? Here are the things that I think actually help based on what the research says and what people report from their own experience. This isn't some Instagram version. It's just a real version. So the first thing that helps is to name what you're feeling specifically. Not just, I feel bad. Let's get a little more granular. Is it guilt? Is it grief? Is it fear? Is it loneliness? Is it relief and terror at the same time? The research on emotional granularity, which is the ability to precisely identify what you're feeling, consistently shows that it reduces the intensity of the emotion. When you can say, this is grief for what I hope this relationship would be, instead of just, this is unbearable, the brain actually has more to work with. More categories will translate into more capacity. The second thing that works is to validate the feeling without validating the interpretation. Now, this is subtle, but it's one of the most useful things that I know. You can say to yourself, it makes complete sense that I feel guilty right now. I was taught to always put this person's comfort first. Of course, this feels like a rule violation. That's a real feeling, and it's coming from a very real place. And then you also have to push back on that. There has to be a response to that. That might sound like, but feeling guilty is not the same thing as being guilty. This feeling is information about my history. It's not a verdict on my choice. You're not dismissing the guilt that you feel, you're contextualizing it. That's different. And that's actually more honest and more kind to yourself. The third thing that helps is to regulate your nervous system physically. When you're in a stress response after a hard relational event, your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for reasoning, for perspective, and self-compassion, is either limited or offline. You can't think your way into a better place when you're flooded. First, you have to come down physiologically. That might mean extended exhales. Exhaling longer than you inhale, which activates the parasympathetic nervous system. We might splash cold water on your face or even on our wrists. Movement can be helpful. A walk, anything that uses your large muscle groups. The physical sensation of something safe, a weighted blanket, a warm drink, petting an animal, or talking to a trusted person. Not to fix it, just to bring your system back below the threshold so that more of the prefrontal cortex part of the brain is available to you. Number 4, don't make any decision while you're flooded. Don't apologize for the boundary while you're still in the physiological stress response. In fact, don't text. Don't text at all. Don't walk it back in the middle of an anxiety spike. Don't try to have a follow-up conversation when you're flooded. Because the things that feel true in that state, like I went too far, I should have let it go, this was a mistake, are often not the things that feel true when your system has calmed down. So set the phone down and give yourself a window. Number 5, find your people. And by this, I don't mean people who will tell you that you were right no matter what. These aren't people who will just tell you what you want to hear. Although some validation is genuinely helpful, and don't let anyone tell you differently, validation in times like this, when we're in this pain, absolutely helps. But I'm talking about people who can hold the complexity with you, that you know would be honest with you. You're going to trust their validation more. People who can say, yeah, this is really hard. It makes so much sense that you're in so much pain. I also think you did the right thing. Without it being either toxic positivity or piling on. The loneliness of the boundary aftermath is real. But hopefully you don't have to white knuckle through it alone. Number 6, look for small evidence. As the initial acute discomfort settles, start noticing small things. Moments where you didn't feel like you had to manage someone else's emotions. Moments of unexpected lightness. Moments where you said what you actually thought and the world didn't end. These are small data points, and they matter, and they will make a difference. The nervous system learns through experience, and consciously cataloging the moments when being more honest didn't destroy everything helps build the new neural pathways, literally. Number 7, give it time. But don't use time as a reason to avoid. The hangover does lift. So let's be clear about that. It's not a permanent state. For most people, the acute distress settles within days to a couple of weeks. And what is an emotional landscape that is easier to navigate. Not easy, but easier than when the acute distress was there. The acute distress does lift faster when you don't avoid the discomfort and when you don't collapse back into the old pattern to get relief. If every time the guilt spikes, you apologize and you walk the boundary back or you reach out for contact, you're teaching your nervous system that the discomfort is intolerable and must be escaped. Tolerating the discomfort, not pleasantly and not without struggle, but just tolerating it, is how the system will recalibrate. Now, let me zoom out for a moment before we close. People who are genuinely working on their capacity for self-respect, self-advocacy, and authentic relating. The discomfort of the early boundary doesn't go away entirely, but it does change. It becomes less acute. It gets shorter in duration. The gap between I set the boundary and I believe I did the right thing narrows with time. And that's not because they become people who don't feel. It's because they accumulate experience that the sky doesn't fall, that the guilt they feel is survivable, that relationships that cannot tolerate their limits were not actually offering the thing they wanted, and that relationships that can tolerate their limits and that grow into something more honest and mutual as a result are worth the discomfort of going through that. There's also a shift that happens internally. The person who's been at this for a while, who's done the work of reclaiming their disowned needs, of sitting with the guilt, of not caving when the wave hits, they start to have a different relationship to their own sense of rightness. They start to trust themselves a little bit more. The internal verdict over time matters as much as the external one. And the ability to trust your own sense of what's okay and what isn't is one of the most profound things a human being can develop. It doesn't happen quick. It's not linear. And it doesn't feel like a lot of the clips or reels or carousels that we see. But it is real and it is available to you. And you don't have to feel good about the boundary for it to be a step in that direction. The fact that it hurts doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It actually means you're doing it. It just means you're doing it. If you've set a boundary and you felt worse, if you expected relief and got guilt and grief and that low-grade terror instead, I hope what today gave you is a framework for that experience, a map for the territory that you landed in. The guilt is not evidence of wrongdoing. It's just evidence of an old role and an old way of being, but the grief is real. The grief is for the relationship you hope for and for the version of yourself that you've been carrying. The nervous system response is physiological and not a character flaw. And with time, it does get better. The discomfort you feel is not actually about going back. But you do have to stay and move through it. Here's the thing that I want to leave with you. Feeling worse after doing something healthy is one of the most disorienting human experiences because we're wired to use feeling as feedback. If it feels bad, it must be bad. If it causes others pain, we've got to stop doing it. But growth doesn't always follow that logic. Growth is almost always uncomfortable. Whether that's the first day at the gym after a long period, the first honest conversation with a partner, the first time you said, "I'm not okay," when someone asked, all of it feels wrong before it feels right. All of it costs you something before it pays off. And boundaries are the same. The relief comes, I promise you, it does come, but not at the moment you say the words. It comes later when you look back and see that you held, that you didn't collapse, that you survived the guilt, the grief, the fear, and the silence, and you're still here, more yourself than you were before. That's the promise of change. Not that it feels good, but that it's worth it. Thanks so much for being here today. This one was actually close to my heart. And if it resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. The number of people who are walking their limits back because no one told them the aftermath was supposed to feel like this, that's a lot of people. And we can change that. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. There's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.